Welcome back to Money Matters. A few weeks ago, the Chinese government issued a decree that all private tutoring companies must be not-for-profit. This sent markets tumbling as education-linked stocks were dumped by nervous investors. Beijing also tightened regulations on some of China's top-performing tech companies and canceled some large IPOs. Money Matters spoke to Ryan Manuel, Chief Asia Strategist of Silverhorn Group, to find out what he thinks the motives are behind the crackdown. So Ryan, is the worst over now with the rout on education companies?
I think so, yes. The shift now has come to the problems of implementation and in actually making this central decree work, which is very difficult.
Right. What was that about anyway? It seems like the government didn't realize the effect that decree would have on the stock market and on equities.
You know, the Chinese government is still learning in many ways. It owns things. And so the last few years, we've seen a shift towards announcements such as this one that will have a big impact on markets. And so there's definitely some things that they know there. But there's another factor of they don't care. It's not their main audience. This isn't a decree that is designed to alleviate the concerns of institutional investors. This is something that is tried to make Chinese mums and dads think, okay, some of the pressure that's on me is being relieved.
And what effect will that have on investors, especially foreign investors, in Chinese equities?
There's a lot of fear. And part of that, though, is again, from the Chinese government's perspective, their job is to run the country. And that's what they see their job as. Again, for the government, their focus is on running the country, and this is the policy goal they wish to achieve, is to make it much more difficult for sort of tech firms and private after-school tutoring firms to run their business without some sort of regulation and management. And that's, the scarier the message from the government perspective, kind of the better.
There's been a clampdown on a lot of Chinese tech companies. Do you expect this to continue?
There's definitely this back and forth between the government and the tech companies. That means that they need each other. The tech companies need to be left alone, and the government needs the tech companies. So that will make things difficult. At the same point, the Chinese government is showing that it's less focused on the impact on stock market prices and national champions in that sense, and it's really laser-like focused on regulations and what it sees as the best thing for domestic economy. There's going to be tensions between that. What I do think is that there's not a concerted strategy to get the tech companies. Tech companies are extraordinarily good at delivering services. And so the government knows it needs the tech companies. Its anti-poverty campaign was pushed mainly by Tencent and Alibaba mechanisms. Even in the floods recently, the first people to donate, Alibaba, Tencent, very high profile. And so the tech companies, they're locked in this delicate dance. And so definitely the government wants to show the tech companies, hey, guys, watch yourselves.
Right.
But the tech companies have much more give than one would think.
Okay, so it's really about regulation then?
Yeah. And look, that's something we're not just seeing in China. Every country is struggling with this idea of how do we regulate. And the Chinese government's actions to sort of restrict tech company access to data, for example, are quite a long way ahead of other countries that you'd probably expect to be more advanced. I mean, China's data privacy laws are better than the US's, for example.
Really? In what way?
They give the user more control, and they're also much more prescriptive on how long data can be stored for. But there's definitely an element in, say, the new draft regulations for electric vehicles as to how long you can keep user data. The user must buy in, as in they must click a box to allow you to store data. That's a legal right. The final part is that China has this sort of its own Bill of Rights, the Civil Code. They only brought it to life last year, where that gives citizens quite a lot of rights over their data. There's a number of articles which, similar to the EU, not as strict as the EU, but which gives citizens some rights as to the ownership of their data and their image, for example, and things such as that, which is not something we're seeing in the US or Australia or the UK.
I think this is probably the first time I've heard about this, that actually private citizens are able to protect their data.
I mean, part of why it happened is because it got so out of hand in the first place. So the lived experience in China for a while has been one of a lot of scams, a lot of pressure on people. Human flesh search was a thing for a while, for example, which was a not particularly nice phenomenon of people going and using the internet to really hunt people down, and vigilante style, almost mobs. And to their credit, I mean, the Chinese government has done something about that, and that's something that's a dynamic that's playing out in all countries. It's an unexplored problem of the current China-US tensions and just general tensions with China internationally, is that it's ruling out some of the learning of and cooperation on things such as this. There's a whole bunch of shared challenges which aren't just climate change, where actually Chinese legislation, whilst sometimes flawed in its implementation, the legislation is really quite well done, well drafted, it's well thought through, it's responsive to concerns about people's everyday lives.
It's kind of the tech Cold War, and I guess the consumers are losing out.
China-US, who's winning the tech battle, who's winning the war for AI, when much more is it's like anything where you have big firms listed in the US who use it. They just want to pay their bills, talk to their friends, book movies, do all the many things you can do here that we just take for granted.
Okay, so yeah, this is the melting pot for tech.
And in fact, this is one of the great benefits of Hong Kong that I've never really heard people talk about. Here was probably one of the only places in the world where we can use all the really cool things that are happening in China and all the really cool things that are happening in the West. You can really do this fascinating mix and match. I think it's a real strength of Hong Kong that other countries don't get to benefit, either because of not sort of having the language skills and the sort of, I guess, being used to using it that we have here, and then on the other side, just being banned. I mean, in China and in the US, there's this really ugly tit for tat, tick for tock, I ban you, you ban me, going on right now that is blocking off this ability to use the best of what's coming out of both countries. I think it's a real export sort of success story for Hong Kong. I'm quite big on it. Hong Kong is a place that melds different tech stacks. And long may it continue, because of course that's one of the possible areas where we could be caught in the firing line here.
Are we still going to see Chinese companies listing in the US, or will we see more of them coming over and listing in Hong Kong?
I mean, this is bad if you want to list in the US. It's worrisome for two reasons. One is, of course, the actions and the overt banning of listing as per this decree, education. And the other part is there's been a lot of questioning about this variable interest entity model, which is a kind of very unusual way of listing a company. Capital is so deep in the US, the markets are so deep, and so, as you said, some will come here to Hong Kong. Yeah, I think that's pretty likely, because that's not quite the same, but there's still very deep capital markets here. Because Hong Kong is still an easier place to list. Hong Kong has that advantage, and so it seems like, well, if you have an opportunity, now's the time to push forward some new ideas.